Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with us Jeff Deist, a friend of mine going back a number of years. Jeff is the president of the Mises Institute, and he was also previously chief of staff to Congressman Ron Paul. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for joining me again.
Thank you, Jay. It's good to talk to you.
Always good to have you here. Now, we have such a short period of time, but I want to ask you a couple of points I'd like to ask you about. You know, we've heard much talk about the brilliance of Janet Yellen. Larry Fink of BlackRock was on CNBC, or I think it was on Bloomberg last week, praising her. The stock market went up for a couple of days during the rate rise discussions. And what I know that the people your economists there at Mises don't. You know, they're not in the business of predicting market directions. They're more involved with economic theory and what's going on. But what is the sort of census of where we stand heading into 2016? What's the general feeling among your economists and yourself as well, Jeff, about what 2016 looks like?
Well, Jay, I think the consensus is this, is that we are in a bizarro world. And what makes it all the more bizarre is that people at the Fed, including Yellen herself, and other mainstream economists and others in the financial media won't admit this. They will not admit or sort of confess that there's an 800-pound gorilla on our backs. And that gorilla is this extraordinary monetary policy era we find ourselves in. And they want to just sort of sweep this under the rug and act as though these little tinkering technical changes represent some sort of policy, when in fact they represent a tacit or an implicit admission that nobody really knows what the hell the Fed is doing. I mean, here we're talking about a situation where I was listening to NPR the other day after Yellen announced the rate hike. And when I say rate hike, I mean a quarter of a percentage point in the targeted federal funds rate, the overnight interbank lending rate, right? It was recently as the 2008 crash that the Fed funds rate was over 5%.
Wow.
Okay? And of course, back in the time of real tight monetary policy, when Paul Volcker was Fed chairman in the 70s and early 80s, we had a Fed funds rate of nearly 20%. In other words, there was actually interest being paid among banks for the privilege of borrowing money, and that rate, of course, was reflected in interest earned by the general public in their savings accounts, for example. So the idea that going from a zero effective funds rate to a quarter point effective funds rate is somehow meaningful is laughable. It's entirely laughable. But what's not so funny is that the world, waits in thrall for the Yellens and the Lagardes and even the Larry Summers of the world that chime in on all this. And it's really it's unseemly, to put it mildly, and it's also crazy. It's crazy to think that a central authority can manipulate the price of money and the supply of money, and in doing so, more than quadruple the Fed's balance sheet in just a few short years, and not expect there to be negative consequences from this. I mean, that seems to me one of the great issues of our day that goes completely unnoticed.
It's total hubris as far as I can see because, first of all, what they do, they create that 800-pound gorilla out of their laboratory. It's an animal that they don't have any control over or understand. And now we have, you created all these bubbles, these misallocation of resources of capital. You don't allow capital to be priced, so I submit that it's a destruction of capitalism essentially. But, speaking of money, real money, that's gold. The money that the markets have chosen, an asset-based money, not a liability-based money, not a money that's a political money, but a real market-driven money, gold. James Rickards has some interesting things to tell us about gold and the Chinese. With the limited amount of time that we have here, Jeff, could you pass that on? Some of the ideas and insights from James Rickards has to do with geopolitics as much as economics, if not more so.
Yeah, I will say this. I think he's good, and he's definitely someone I read and would even pay to read. Mm-hmm. He's been talking a long time about the IMF allowing the Chinese yuan into its basket of currencies, which are used to determine the price of SDR, special drawing rights. And he was actually predicting 2016 when that happened. It happened about a year earlier. Mm-hmm. But his idea behind why this happened is that China, both in terms of Chinese government and Chinese households, have been buying and hoarding gold. In other words, gold has been flowing from the West to the east into China. And he posits that the idea behind this was not that the Chinese thought that gold was going to go way up in value relative to currencies and make them rich, or that the Chinese thought gold was on the precipice of becoming real, actual, transacted money again, pending some crash. No, it's the idea that by having lots and lots of gold, they would have the power and the weight to demand a place at the IMF table, and in fact, they seem to have achieved this. So It seems like this amassing of gold in China by China was a geopolitical move, and now the rest of the world has to sit up and take notice that after obviously decades and decades as an economic backwater relative to its size and population, China, the yuan now has to be seen as a serious player in the world with the pound sterling, with the dollar, with the euro, and with the Swiss franc.
At the same time, Jeff, if what I read from Zero Hedge is accurate, the Russians and the Chinese have actually been using gold to transact their business. To a great extent, according to one source that I read, the Russians have taken in a huge amount of gold from the Chinese in exchange for oil. And it seems as though we've read a lot about, when the U.S. tried to put sanctions on Russia and threatened to take away the SWIFT payment system from the Russians to freeze them out of the system, then they and the other BRIC countries, in particular, I think China and Russia, decided that they were going to set up an alternative payment system to the SWIFT system. And in fact, it seems as though as the attitude towards those nations have turned more bellicose from the United States, that in fact that we're actually seeing, perhaps, I don't know to what extent this is true or whether it's any great amount, but the amount of gold that Russia reportedly is taking in, a large amount of it from China. It's a tremendous amount. It seems like it's not insignificant. Let's put it that way. Is it possible that maybe the BRICS are sort of using this, okay, if you guys want to play your game, we can set up ours, we'll compete with you, because they are setting up their institutions to compete with the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, right? Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's no question about it. It's almost as though U.S. policymakers and U.S. politicians and U.S. central bankers don't think that their actions will have reactions around the world. Look, the world is preparing slowly to move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I would suspect, and Mr. Rickards certainly believes, that SDRs, IMF's special drawing rights, are the coming reserve currency of the world. If that can't be held up as a geopolitical reality, then maybe gold and silver will once again emerge as the de facto reserve currency for all state-run currencies. But look, again, it's bizarro land. In the short term, it is not in the interests of the BRIC nations to have the dollar suffer a precipitous and fast decline, especially Japan and China, because they hold so many dollar-denominated assets. Same with Brazil. They would hate to see all that money sort of flowing out of Brazil. But in the long run, it is clearly in the best interests of all of those countries to have the U.S. dollar no longer serve as the world's reserve currency. So, given that sort of seesaw reality, it becomes a game of musical chairs. How can we slowly let the air out of the dollar, and who will be the one holding the bag, so to speak, and who will be able to dump their dollars earlier?
Well, I think it's really very fascinating time, actually, in geopolitics and what's going on. The fact that the United States doesn't want to allow China to patrol its own sea lanes. I can only imagine what we would feel like if the Chinese sent their Navy over here into the Gulf of Mexico or on the Atlantic coast or the Pacific coast and started to determine and tell us that we couldn't have control of our own sea lanes. It's just, it's really fascinating when you watch it and, how money fits into the whole equation. Jeff, with 2 minutes left here, just want to ask you, since you have been in the political world, I know you have a great deal of disdain for it, but do you see anything going on in the Republican Party here? I mean, it seems like a circus to me. But is anybody there, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, anybody that would really, truly change things for the better?
Well, I think what you're seeing is disdain and even mocking and ridiculing of sort of the Bush-Clinton axis that people expected to dominate the 2016 election. So that in and of itself, I think, is a healthy thing. There's nothing wrong with populism per se. Obviously, it can be a double-edged sword when non-intellectualism can quickly veer into hostility or anti-intellectualism. So I don't begrudge Trump's populism, and I do like the fact that here is this guy who is basically making fun of the political elites. He's basically making a mockery of the two parties, and he's basically, I think, single-handedly sunk Jeb's chances. So for that alone, I think we should celebrate it. People say, well, his policies are terrible or they're ill-libertarian. Look, presidential candidates do not have policies, people. Even today, in a world of executive orders, there's still this pesky thing called Congress, right? Oh. Presidential candidates have promises which they never hold up. They have platitudes. They have narratives, they have stump speeches, but this idea that, well, Hillary's policies should be compared to Trump's policies. When people say that kind of stuff, I feel like I want to ask them if they're in kindergarten. Yeah, I mean, right. It's so childish and naive. We vote for tribal reasons, and you either love or hate Trump viscerally. You either love or hate Hillary viscerally. So that's really the bottom line to me.
All right, Jeff. We'll have to let it go at that. We're out of time, unfortunately. Thanks so much for joining me again. We'll have to do it more often again. It's always great to get your insights, politics and economics from the Mises Institute. Thank you very much.